Let's stop acting surprised by the complete mess this country has turned into.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's denial in August that Rudy Cabana was being investigated for offences under the Terrorism Act didn't protect the trial, because we found out these facts anyway when Rudy Cabana was charged in October.
It's not like we couldn't see it coming. The warning signs were as clear as a neon light cutting through the fog in Piccadilly Circus.
And the same disclosure didn't cause other trials, such as that of the Parsons Green tube bomber, to fail before. I'm not talking about the details of prevent referrals, which the Home Secretary has used in answers to similar questions, but of the information that was disclosed in October. If a jury knew that before the trial, why couldn't the Prime Minister have told the country the truth in August?
And yet, here we are, shaking our heads in despair, while those meant to lead look more lost than a tourist on the tube without a map. The current leadership? Where do we even begin? Perhaps with the glaringly obvious, because it's always the obvious they seem determined to ignore. Let's talk priorities, the lack thereof. While they swan around Westminster, more concerned with their inflated egos than the needs of the people who put them there.
That is the British justice system that we have. It is the decisions made by police, it's decisions made by the prosecutors. They are rightly independent of ministers.
We ordinary folk are left trying to make sense of bills that don't add up and promises that never leave the drawing board. It's all just theatre. Some might say, and you know what? They'd be right. But this theatre has a woeful cast, a dreadful script, and we unfortunately are the audience footing the bill literally. Don't get me wrong, I am not opposed to a bit of spectacle in politics. A rousing speech here, a bold vision there, that's all well and good. But what do we get? Nothing but amateur improvisation, with leaders stumbling over their own lines and, worse, playing games with our lives.
It's a very important question. I would be grateful if the Home Secretary would directly answer that in her response. Now, the Prime Minister this morning acknowledged that he knew about the background to the case and to Rudy Cabana himself, including the fact that he had been referred to Prevent on 3 separate occasions, and that Rudy Cabana had been found to be in possession of ricin, a highly toxic chemical, and a manual detailing al-Qaeda methods, itself an offence under the Terrorism Act. The Prime Minister also said this morning that he did not disclose any of this to the public in the days and weeks after the murders for fear of prejudicing the subsequent murder trial.
How is this even possible? I ask myself every night, staring at the ceiling, as the day's news plays on a loop in my mind like a bad tune you can't shake. How has this country, once a beacon of global leadership, been reduced to this state? And meanwhile, in the latest twist, the Home Secretary Yvette addressed the House of Commons, stating that the measures taken against Cabana were far too weak. She described the Southport attack as one of the most barbaric crimes, announcing a public inquiry into the case. Yet, she managed to sidestep the most crucial issue. Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, slammed the lack of transparency, arguing that more openness could have prevented the riots. Oh, and let's not forget the moment she lost her temper when a backbencher posed an actually important and difficult question about Labour's failures. Just watch the clip, it says it all.
The Prime Minister's denial in August that Rudy Cabana was being investigated for offences under the Terrorism Act didn't protect the trial, because we found out these facts anyway when Rudy Cabana was charged in October. And the same disclosure didn't cause other trials, such as that of the Parsons Green tube bomber, to fail before. I'm not talking about the details of prevent referrals, which the Home Secretary has used in answers to similar questions, but of the information that was disclosed in October. If a jury knew that before the trial, why couldn't the Prime Minister have told the country the truth in August?
Home Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Member will know that the investigation is carried out by the police. The Crown Prosecution Service decide what charges to lay, and also decide, based on the evidence that they have gathered, how and when those charges should be laid. That is the British justice system that we have. It is the decisions made by police, it's decisions made by the prosecutors. They are rightly independent of ministers, and to be honest, I strongly believe, as part of our British judicial tradition, that independence must continue.
Now, watch this full clip of Chris Philp questioning her and draw your own conclusions.
Rudy Cabana was encountered multiple times, as the Home Secretary said, by the police, social services, the school system and the Prevent programme over a period of several years. The inquiry will find out, I hope, whether mistakes were made or whether the law needs to change. And the Home Secretary mentioned some areas that will rightly be looked at, and I support that. I hope the Home Secretary can also confirm this will include consideration of whether the Mental Health Act was adequate for this case. The Home Secretary has also rightly referred to Prevent. A review of Prevent was conducted by William Shawcross, and the last government responded in February 2024. Will the Home Secretary now commit to implementing all of the recommendations of the Shawcross review? Let me now turn to what happened after the murders and to the importance of openness and transparency. Firstly, and this is a very serious and important question, will the Home Secretary confirm that the inquiry will also cover the government, police and CPS response to the murders, and especially the handling of public communications and the appalling riots that followed? It's a very important question. I would be grateful if the Home Secretary would directly answer that in her response. Now, the Prime Minister this morning acknowledged that he knew about the background to the case and to Radu Bakana himself, including the fact that he had been referred to Prevent on 3 separate occasions, and that Radu Bakana had been found to be in possession of ricin, a highly toxic chemical, and a manual detailing al-Qaeda methods, itself an offence under the Terrorism Act. The Prime Minister also said this morning that he did not disclose any of this to the public in the days and weeks after the murders for fear of prejudicing the subsequent murder trial. And it is, of course, important for journalists and for politicians, and indeed this House, to do nothing that might prejudice a trial. But David Hall, KC, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said this on the Today programme in the context of this case in October, and it bears quoting in full. Jonathan Hall said this: "The government has to be aware that if there is an information gap, then other voices, particularly on social media, will fill that gap." He went on, "If there is any information you can give, put it in the public domain, and be really careful you don't fall into the trap of saying, 'We can say zilch because there are criminal proceedings.' Quite often," he said, "there is a fair amount that can be put into the public domain." Jonathan Hall concluded by saying, "The police now realise that just saying there is a charge, we can't say any more, is not going to cut it these days." So the independent reviewer is saying that the government and police can put some material into the public domain without prejudicing subsequent trials. And in fact, on October the 29th, Radu Bakana was charged with possessing the ricin and the terror manual. That was then made public. So if it can be made public in October without risking prejudice of the murder trial, it follows that it could have been made public in August without prejudicing that same trial. Background facts on other cases over the years have been made public after arrest and before trial without prejudice, and the shields relating to 2 of those cases are in this chamber. So why did the Prime Minister not make public some of this background information in August when he knew it, when later disclosure of that information in October demonstrated such disclosure could be made without prejudice? And why did the Deputy Prime Minister on July the 31st dismiss as, and I quote, "fake news" those saying there may be further facts to come out? Let me just briefly, Mr. Speaker, before concluding, explain why this is important. As Jonathan Hall said, if there is a void, then misinformation, especially online, can fill that void. And this appears to be what happened here. And some of that information, it is said, originated overseas from hostile states. It is possible, indeed it is even likely, that this misinformation that was put into the void fueled the totally unacceptable riots we then subsequently saw. So, will the Home Secretary accept, given what I've just said and what Jonathan Hall said, does she accept there should and could have been more openness and transparency, as I just set out, without prejudicing the trial, and that disclosing more of that truth openly and transparently would have helped combat the damaging misinformation that circulated and which arguably fueled the riots? Will she confirm the inquiry will look at that aspect of events? Mr. Speaker, this was an appalling tragedy. Young girls murdered with their whole lives ahead of them. Let us all learn the lessons from this tragedy in honour of their memory.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Shadow Home Secretary raised a series of points, which is obviously a substantial shift in position for him and his party from the position they have taken in government. He asked about whether the status of the inquiry. I can confirm it's going to start quickly on a non-statutory basis in the same way that the Angelini inquiry did, but I can confirm it will be given whatever powers it needs, including on a statutory basis, so that it can get any information that it needs. He referred to the Shawcross review. I can confirm that the government has implemented 33 out of the 34 recommendations, but I would just gently point out to him that actually the approach that the Shawcross review took was to say that the PREVENT programme should be narrowed and should actually just focus particularly on the cases around terrorism, and in fact could have put at risk, actually including less cases like this where ideology is less clear. He then raises the issue about the information that was provided, and he will know that the Contempt of Court Act was set out in 1981. Jonathan Hall has indeed highlighted the problem of disinformation online, social media actors who are not bound by the same rules that the police, the media and the government follow. And he refers, for example, to the name and the nationality being provided, which in practice they were in this case, after misinformation appeared online. But ultimately, he has also said all of this is governed by the Contempt of Court Act 1981, and the Law Commission is reviewing that. But it is not for the government to ignore the law or the advice that we are given when justice for families is at stake. And let me point out to him that the previous Conservative government did not publish information before the trial about the PREVENT referral for the perpetrator who killed Sir David Amis. None of us criticised them for that because none of us wanted to put at risk justice for Sir David's family, nor did they publish information before the trial on the PREVENT referral of the asylum seeker who killed Tom Roberts. In fact, they didn't even publish that after the trial. It only came out in the inquest. And the minister, who even after the trial refused to answer my questions on whether they knew that he was wanted for murdering 2 people in Serbia when he was allowed to enter the country, was the current Shadow Justice Secretary. Now, we have been keen to publish the information on PREVENT referrals from the start, but throughout, the advice to us has been clear. And if we had ignored the advice that we were given from about the case that put towards us and about the information that the police and the CPS were working through in order to get justice, and if as a result a killer had walked free, no one would ever have forgiven the government or anyone else. The most important thing is to get justice, and then once justice is secured, to make sure at this point the questions are answered about what went wrong and why 3 young girls' lives were lost. That is the question he should be focusing on right now.
What do you make of this shambolic government? Give this video a like if you agree it's high time they were shown the door. And don't forget to subscribe.